Hi everyone, today I'm going to talk about relative pronouns. But to understand relative pronouns, first I need to talk about clauses. So we have two main types of clauses. We have independent clauses and subordinate clauses, and the subordinate clauses are going to be particularly important when talking about relative pronouns, and I'll explain in just a minute. But I just want to highlight some differences and similarities between these two. So note that both independent clauses and subordinate clauses have a subject and a verb. So in the independent clauses, we're expressing a complete thought, and they can be either a complete sentence on their own or they can be part of a sentence. So I gave us an example: Jem studied in the library for his French quiz. Now, that again could be a sentence on its own. It makes total sense. So the difference with subordinate clauses is that they do not express a complete thought and they cannot be a complete sentence. They can only be part of a sentence. So if we had something like, when Jim studied in the library for his French quiz, that is not a complete thought, so we could finish it with another clause. And here we have an example of a subordinate conjunction with when. And some other examples are after, although, because, even if, in order that, until, etc. But we can also use relative pronouns to join clauses. So a subordinate clause can begin with a relative pronoun, and here's an example with the relative pronoun who. I gave a treat to the dog who was very well behaved. If we look at the second clause of that sentence, who was very well behaved, it does not make sense on its own, so it is the subordinate clause. So relative pronouns in English include that, which, who, whom, whose, when, and where. In French, we have two types of relative pronouns that we like to talk about, and they are simple and compound or composed. And so the simple relative pronouns, the nice thing is that they are invariable and that they don't have to agree in gender and number. So we have que or qu apostrophe if the word that follows que starts with a vowel. We also have qui, dont, ou, ce que, ce qui, and then for the composed or compound relative pronouns we have lequel and its various forms. That one is variable, and I will talk about that later. So again, a relative pronoun is used to connect a subordinate clause to the main clause, so you don't have to repeat subjects or objects. So again, it's the same idea that we've been talking about with pronouns. It's to avoid repetition. And so some other characteristics of relative pronouns are that they can be subjects, direct objects, or objects of a preposition. And in French, they are required, while sometimes they're optional in English. For example, sometimes there are instances where we can use that, or other times they may be left out, and the sentence still makes sense. So here are some examples in English using who, whom, whose, which, that, when, where. Those are all relative pronouns or joining the two clauses. So we have to also think about sentence structure when we talk about relative pronouns in English versus French. And here we have an example with, this is the book that everyone is talking about, or in French, c'est le livre dont tout le monde parle. With the English, we can say that, and we can leave that preposition about at the end, and that's fine. We may change that in formal English, but in French, note that we cannot do the same thing. The sentence structure will change. We'll get to that in just a few minutes, what that means, but here it's replacing de and the object, le livre, and so we're not going to leave a preposition hanging on at the end. Okay, just to review the simple relative pronouns, we have qui, which replaces the subject, que, which replaces a direct object, dont replaces an object preceded by de. It can mean of which or of whom in English. It can also mean that, depending on the context. And then ou replaces a direct object referring to a time or place. So grammatically, it's doing the same thing as que, but it changes the meaning. So any place that we would want to say where or when, we're going to use ou in French. So have some examples. I've used qui, que, and ou on this slide. And in the first example, we have garçon. The garçon is the subject if we look at the second clause. So when we join that and make it as one sentence, garçon again is the subject. He's the one who's wearing a t-shirt. And in the second example, garçon is the direct object, so it's going to take que to replace it. So we're saying that's the boy that John introduced me to. And then in the third example, maison is again the direct object, but here we want to mean where, because we're trying to say it's the house where the boy lives. Notice this is another example of syntax change or sentence structure change, because instead of having subject-verb, we actually have verb-subject. But it is important to notice what's in that subordinate clause, because it can help you also figure out whether it's supposed to be qui or another relative pronoun. For example, if you look in that first sentence again, we have porte un t-shirt, and we do not have a subject after, like in that subordinate clause. Whereas in the third one we do. So again, qui replaces the subject, whereas ou is just replacing the direct object. Now, donc is probably the most difficult one for English speakers because it pretty much reminds us of a more formal English, because we often translate it of to, of which, or of whom, which we don't say as often in spoken English, of course. But the main idea there is that donc is going to replace an object that is preceded by de, and that's going to happen a lot with our verbs on the left, those verbs that take the preposition de that I gave you in a homework as well. And I wanted to take this specific example of parler de, so to talk about or speak about something. And notice that donc can be either the complement of a verb, complement of a noun, or even the complement of an adjective. So in the first example, I'm talking to you about the novel. So again, here we have parler de, so it's the complement of a verb. In the second example, je connais pas le nom de ce roman, it is the complement of a noun, so it's of the name of the book. So de ce roman is following noun. And then in the third example, we have the complement of an adjective, the adjective being amoureux, or we would translate that in English to in love with. We would actually use the preposition with. But here, we're going to say c'est Marie dont il est amoureux, so that's Marie with whom, or whom he's in love with, I guess. And again, in spoken English, when we say who, even though it's not grammatically correct. So just to go over this again, I wanted to give you some more examples. So if in number one, I've used que because I highlighted enjeu. If you look at that, enjeu is the direct object. And then if we look at the second example, une prof, again, if we look at the subordinate clause, organiser plein de choses, we can see that we do not have a subject, so qui is going to refer back to une prof, who is the subject. In number three, we have le Venezuela est un pays. Again, it's a direct object, un pays, but here we want it to mean where, so we're going to use où instead of que. In number four, we have c'est une jolie chanson dont je me souviens. The reason we use dont is because this verb, se souvenir de, obviously it takes the preposition de. So if we have de and an object, the object being une jolie chanson here, then that is going to become dont. Okay, we also have ce que, ce qui, and ce dont. Simply put, these are referring to something that has not been named specifically, so it's more general. And so here I wanted to give you an example with each one. We have j'aime ce qui est peu cher. I like cheap things. So that's very general. We haven't named any one thing in particular. I haven't said, oh, I like the dress that's cheap. And then number 2, tu sais ce que j'aime, you know what I like, so we can translate that in English as what because it's not specific. And then for number 3, devine ce dont j'ai envie, again, general, because we're saying guess what I need, and the reason we use dont, again, is because this verb, avoir envie de, takes that preposition de. So to give a summary, again, dont is going to function as the object of a preposition, the preposition de. And then to skip down a little bit, où is going to refer to a place or time. So when, where, we can also translate it sometimes as which or that. And then que is going to function as the direct object, and qui as the subject. Finally, we have lequel, and lequel functions a little differently because it is the object of a preposition that does not mean de on its own, and I'm going to give specific examples, but we also have various forms of lequel. Because as a relative pronoun, lequel replaces an object when that object is preceded by any preposition except a simple de, and then it is going to have contractions depending on whether it's agreeing with a or de, and then whether it's referring to a masculine, feminine, singular, or plural noun. So I have those forms there. So lequel is the relative pronoun that can mean which one or ones, and is required after most prepositions, and I wanted to give you a list of a few more prepositions as examples on the right. So you have à, avec, près de, à côté de, en face de, dont, sur. And so remember that lequel can be used on its own. If it's used on its own, it just means which one or which ones. In the first example, I have j'ai besoin d'un portable, lequel est le moins cher, so we're using that as which one. It is lequel, the masculine singular form, because we're referring to un portable, which is a masculine singular noun. In the second example, I have pour lequel, because the verb payer takes the preposition pour, to pay for. And again, it is lequel masculine singular because I'm once again talking about le portable, which is masculine singular. In the next example, I have il étudie les insectes sur lesquels le biologiste a écrit. So here we're taking the preposition sur with the verb écrire, so to write about is écrire sur. And then we have lesquels, masculine plural, because we're referring to les insectes, which is masculine plural. And finally, we have c'est l'hôtel à côté duquel il y a une boutique. So we're using à côté de as a prepositional phrase, and since that's going to go in front of lequel, the de and le, as you know already, has to become du, and that is masculine singular because we're referring back to l'hôtel, which is masculine singular.